Please be seated. So here we are at the beginning of ordinary time, and the readings for our service today seem more appropriate for Halloween weekend than they do for a week after Memorial Day. Here on this Pride weekend, we've read about the ancient Israelite King Saul going to consult with the so-called Witch of Endor, who summons the ghost of the prophet Samuel from the dead. Then in that gospel reading from Mark, we hear the story of the Gerasene demoniac, who was possessed not by one, but thousands of spirits who called themselves Legion. I can't help but see the similarities of when the pigs run over the edge of the cliffs in the water, and the way the priest falls down the stairs in Georgetown at the end of The Exorcist. But it is not Halloween. Though even if these stories did come at that time, they would still be difficult to interpret. Because when we read stories of witches and evil spirits in the Bible, they may challenge our modern-day sensibilities of asking whether we really believe in actual demons and evil spirits. Upon a closer reading, this gospel story in particular, for me, conveys enduring and important messages about our lives of faith, and they're applicable every season of the year. So I wanted to let you in a bit on how I prepare for a sermon. Make this a teaching sermon, if you will, which is to say, I want you to know, above all, that you are perfectly qualified to engage and read and interpret difficult texts like we have today. As a preacher, as a biblical scholar, I tend to read the Bible in two different ways. Take the first way, the kind of scholarly approach, which is to read from what we call an historical-critical perspective. This kind of reading aims to examine the text's original context, the literary structure, to learn what we can about the original intended audience. In a historical critical reading, we want to look at what is known about the text's author, what sources they may have been using, and what particular worldview they may have brought to their writing project. All you need to do to read in this way is to invest in a good study Bible. I recommend HarperCollins, Oxford, or the CEB. Then there's another way of reading the Bible, and I do this more and more, which is to read the Bible as a springboard for prayer. I come to the text with faith that God is not finished revealing some things to us, that the Spirit will speak through the Bible in ways that transcend and sometimes even contradict the accepted historical critical interpretation. A prayerful reading places us right smack dab in the midst of the story itself. We're invited to use our imagination, to enter the scene like a movie playing in our mind's eye, to use all five of our senses to see what the people in the story saw, to hear the sounds of the setting and the words that were spoken, and maybe to hear what words were spoken that weren't written down in the story, to smell the setting, and even feel and taste the physical world in which the story took place. All you need to read the Bible in this way is a commitment to setting aside the time for prayer and to engage your own imagination. So for me, it's kind of incomplete to only read one way or the other. They work together. And especially for a text like today, I think we need to employ both kinds of readings. So from a historical critical perspective, there's a big problem right at the beginning of this story, which is the setting. And if we care about things like that, because we care about wondering, did this really happen? Is this just a story? We preoccupy ourselves with the setting. And A version of this exact story is told in all three of the synoptic gospels, meaning Mark, Luke, and Matthew. And the location called Gerasa hasn't made sense to readers as early as Matthew himself, who changed the location to Gadara. And even by the 2nd century, people quickly realized that the issue was the geography. None of those places is anywhere close to a body of water. So the body of water that Jesus presumably crossed in the boat and over which the pigs hurled themselves would have been miles and miles away from the cities named. But there's still a historical contextual importance to the scene. Maybe the authors of the Gospels didn't care about those kinds of things, but they did care about making it clear that wherever it may have been, it was Gentile territory. The man from whom the legion demons is exorcised is not Jewish. He's an outsider. Everything about the scene is made to sound otherworldly. It's a dirty, lonely tomb. He's a scary, self-harming man. And of course, you wouldn't find a large herd of pigs in Jewish territory because eating pork is not kosher. The other critical element to a reading that resonates with me is in noticing what comes immediately before and immediately after this story. That's the tool of looking at the literary structure of the text, to zoom the lens out and to see what Mark might have been up to. So right before this story is the very well-known story of Jesus calming the storm at sea, although it's a lake. Jesus had been preaching to a large crowd of followers, and specifically he tells a series of parables. It's where the parable of the sower shows up, which we just read a few weeks ago. And then when evening came, after that long day of preaching, Jesus told the disciples, okay, we need to get in the boat now, we're going to go to the other side. And it's on the boat ride under the cover of night that this windstorm breaks out. And the disciples feel like they're about to perish, but Jesus woke up and rebuked the wind and said, "Be silent, be still." And the wind ceased, and a dead calm came over. And what comes after? Well, he arrives, he meets the demoniac. What we just read occurs. And then Jesus got back in the boat and crossed back to the Jewish side, and his tour of mission work continued. So here's this first meaningful critical point we can conclude from looking at the before and after. Jesus went out of his way to go to the land of the Gentiles and save this demon-possessed man. This is not a spontaneous stop on his missional tour in Galilee. It's fair to conclude that Jesus made the disciples cross the lake for no other reason than to meet this man and save him. And why would he want to do that? This is where the prayerful reading comes into play. Set aside for a moment whether we believe in actual demons who may or may not possess humans. Close your eyes for a moment and place yourself in the scene. Take for granted that what Jesus encountered was truly a miserable person. See the dark and lonely cave of tombs where he dwelled, suffering and totally abandoned beyond hope. Society had ostracized him, cut him off even from his family and friends. See and then feel the loose, broken metal shackles around his wrist, the cold of the stone caves, hidden from the shade of the sun's heat. Hear what the setting would have sounded like. He's described as this untamable beast who's roaming the outskirts of the city, howling and cutting himself. Smell the pigs who are reported to be grazing nearby, and the body odor of the man himself who hasn't bathed in God knows how long. Taste the salty sweat of your own damp skin. We don't need to understand exactly what caused this man's life to be like this, to be moved by the fact that Jesus went out of his way to meet him in his suffering. What's clear is how the story highlights the dynamics of power. We see the demons, who are these scary things. There's thousands of them, but they are terrified of Jesus. They're pleading with Jesus. They're completely at the mercy of Jesus' simple command. They're powerless and forced to submit. This passage leaves no room for doubting Jesus' authority. It's the same with the calming of the sea, in which we learn that Jesus has authority even over creation. Now we meet a Jesus who holds power over the forces of evil and darkness. And so what can we conclude? Jesus alone possesses the power to rescue the demoniac who was enduring a living nightmare of continuous torment. Jesus is the only one capable of restoring the man's health, dignity, agents, peace, and his place in society. And to me, there's one more poignant possibility, which came through my own imaginative reading, which is to explore what exactly happened between verses 14 and 15. Look at it. This is where it says, the pig herders ran off to town to find the crowd and then bring them back. That would have taken a long time, wouldn't it? The town is kind of, a mile away. It takes 30 minutes. Have to tell what happened, convince them that they need to go check out what has happened, and they return. So what happened in that time between? When they come back, this man is forever changed. I imagine he and Jesus had a nice long visit. I assume that if he's clothed and in his right mind, that the disciples and Jesus cleaned him up and gave him something to wear. I don't know what was said, but I can imagine and feel that what was felt was love and care and compassion, awe and gratitude. What happens to the man at the end of the story? He's commissioned to tell of what has happened, to bear witness to how this Jesus of Nazareth went out of his way to meet him in his misery, commanded authority over evil, and broke the shackles of his oppression. And his story is preserved in the gospel to instill in centuries of readers, to instill in you and me the awe-inspiring wonder that Jesus can do the same for us. Amen.